Welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden, coming at you live from our nation's capital in Ottawa. And this morning, it's a real pleasure to have Colonel retired Douglas Macgregor on the show. And I'll bring him on and do a brief intro as soon as we do our own intro here. And I'm just...
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. Yes, please like the show now. We beat the YouTube suppression. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Please subscribe if you haven't. Resubscribe if you need to. We appreciate it. We're heading for another objective of 50,000. Appreciate your support so much. And without further ado, I know you're a busy man, Colonel. I appreciate you coming on. Colonel Macgregor is the Chief Executive Officer of Our Country, Our Choice. He's a former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense during the first Donald Trump administration. He's an armor officer, something I can understand, and a veteran of, among others, the first Gulf War. Welcome to Stand on Guard, Colonel Macgregor.
Sure, happy to be with you.
It's so nice to have you. I must say, I first saw you when you appeared on Tucker Carlson's last show on Fox News. Tucker Carlson Tonight. He would often have you on and to give a completely different perspective on Ukraine than everybody else on Fox News was offering, including former four-star generals who thought the Russian army was on the brink of defeat within 3 weeks. I remember watching that and thinking, are these people real? I said, they spent 30 years in the military at general officer level, and they really think the Russian army is going to collapse because of Ukrainian might. And of course, I listened to you, and suddenly, it became a lot clearer, and I began to understand that this was these generals, and I think I've heard you say this before. These generals who appear on Fox News, on CNN, are so linked in with the military-industrial establishment. It's a revolving door. They leave the military and they go work for Raytheon or General Dynamics or one of these other huge armaments industries, and they just can't find enough wars out there to satisfy their need for money. So I was totally on side, because I used to be in favor of every U.S. war. And like I said, I'm a former military officer, senior officer in the Canadian Air Force. I think many times, I think about my career now, and half the time I was a propagandist. But I recently wrote a column for Human Events, which I think you'll find interesting. This just appeared yesterday. And it's about a subject that you've been talking about quite a bit. I think I heard you talk about this with Clayton Morris on Redacted recently. And this is the dangers we're now in the Middle East. And I think Donald Trump appeared to be pushing back on Israel's demand that the United States join them in an airstrike against Iran, which, of course, is going to usher in a regional conflict, at least, if not World War III. And Trump responded to that report and said, I'm just not in a rush to do it. And now we're hearing Israel might go it alone. Are you confident that Donald Trump can resist the pressure for an attack on Iran that might result in a regional or nuclear war, even if he is, as you noted so many times, very beholden to Israel?
Well, I think the short answer is no, not at all. I would correct you on one point, though. I don't expect anything to be nuclear. There's simply no requirement to fall back on the use of nuclear weapons. Now, if there are nuclear weapons employed at all, they'll be employed by the Israelis as a last desperate attempt to achieve their aims. But even that, I think, is unlikely. So it'll be conventional, whatever it happens. High-end conventional wars are very destructive, as we've seen in Ukraine. So that in no way suggests that this is somehow another better or more humane. I just don't see the nuclear play coming to the fore. But it's going to be very difficult. And frankly, I have a feeling the game is already up. We're getting a lot of information now from various sources suggesting that the Israelis are prepping, getting their aircraft ready for the strike. we've already assembled, a huge amount of firepower, primarily Air Force and Navy, missiles, hundreds of aircraft, jets. Listen, I think this is a go. It's just not going to be stopped this time.
Well, that's certainly not optimistic, but I would have to agree with you. Do you think Russia, given the fact that it has a loose sort of military pact with Iran, it's arguable how solid that pact is. Do you think Russia would intervene in the event of such an attack by Israel, even Israel alone or Israel with the United States? And what would be the reaction of the Arab world?
Well, I think the Russians will intervene at some point when we come into the fight. And remember that if the Israelis should strike out on their own, it's only a matter of time until we're dragged in on the grounds that, we have to, quote unquote, assist or help or rescue Israel. So it doesn't matter whether we're in it initially or the Israelis are the first to fly. It doesn't make any difference. We'll be involved. We have to step back and look at the whole region. The Chinese have conducted joint drills recently, operations with the Egyptians. China is invested in Egypt and has no intention of letting the Israelis do enormous damage there. And the Israelis have always privately warned the Egyptians that they would strike the Aswan Dam and cause a flooding that could jeopardize the lives of millions of people and, of course, destroy Egypt. The Chinese aren't going to allow that to happen. They've got aircraft sitting on the tarmac right now in Cairo. At the same time, the Chinese are also connected to Iran for obvious reasons. It's not just oil, natural gas, and other things. It's really because the Chinese view, and I think the Russians share this view, that they'll be on the list in the future. If they don't come to the aid of these states, eventually they too will be attacked. Now, we can all argue and say, well, that's not really true. We won't do that. But from their vantage point, the way they look at the world right now, that's not an unreasonable assumption. And then finally, if you look at the rest of the region, knowing how fragile the various regimes and societies are, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, I think you could see all of those places collapse, those regimes removed. And I think Iraq would come roaring back in as a major player strategically because of the numerous militias and military organizations that are supportive of Iran in that country. And at some point, I think the Turks are going to have to make a choice. I mean, right now, they've been the beneficiaries of their willingness to tolerate Israeli military expansion and territorial expansion. But that won't last long. They'll have to make a choice because at the end of the day, if you talk to people in the region, they're all expressing a certain amount of disappointment that the Turks have failed so miserably to pay attention to and intervene on behalf of people in the region that were once part of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, after all, for hundreds of years, the Turks ruled everything in the Levant and all across the Arabian Peninsula, and they've done nothing. And on the other hand, here are the Shiite Persians, who seem to be the only ones standing up and being counted in this fight against the Israelis. So the whole thing will come apart. The region will change beyond recognition. And it's only a question of how far the Russians or the Chinese will go to prevent us from reducing Iran to rubble, which I'm quite sure is the plan.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of commentators, including Professor John Mearsheimer of Chicago University, have suggested that if this becomes a regional war, it's going to ultimately perhaps mean the end of Israel itself, because it's going to create a coalition of angry defense partners in the Arab world. Why is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu so intent upon carrying this to the ultimate degree?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu represents this Likudnik strain in Israel that is determined to essentially demonstrate its supremacy across the West as well as across the Middle East. His expectation is that with the support of the American military establishment, that he can subjugate the entire Muslim world to his will. And frankly, to this point, there's a lot of evidence to suggest he's not entirely wrong. There's been almost no pushback against the mass murder and expulsion of human beings from Gaza. No real violent response to the enormous damage done in Lebanon, including the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. What's happened in Syria is another example. And of course, we've always helped these things along. We've worked closely with the Israelis. That's one of the reasons the Turks cast their lot with us in Syria. So I think the bottom line is Mearsheimer is right, but this was pretty obvious 2 weeks after the 7th October. And one thing that I'm not sure Mearsheimer has looked at, but I have, and I have serious doubts about the alleged surprise of 7th October. I think the Israelis let that happen because it was going to be used as the rationale or justification for this war of Jewish supremacy in the Middle East, and also to tighten their grip on the West, especially the English-speaking world. They've had their grip or their hands on the throat of the Anglo-American sphere for a long time, certainly financially. So I think this is part and parcel of that operation.
So if you were back advising the current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, what would be your advice as a way to get out of this that would at least absolve us from having to escalate?
I'd advise him to resign because there's no way to get out. This is a foregone conclusion. Remember, he's one of these Christian Zionists. He and his team were appointed because they swore allegiance to whatever Israel wants. Go back and look at the various videos that came out of the Department of Defense shortly after he took over and Mr. Netanyahu with his team came for a visit. They all sat in the conference room that belongs to the Secretary of Defense. It's right across from his office, literally. He trooped in there with his team. Mr. Netanyahu trooped in there with his, and he sat across from Mr. Netanyahu and says, you can look at this team and look at me, and you know that there's nothing we will not do. And we are there for you. You tell us what you want, and we'll do it. The problem with Hegseth, of course, is that he was never qualified for the job to begin with. He didn't understand the gravity of the situation. I don't think he understood the enormous responsibility that he's got. And as a consequence, when it became increasingly clear to him that this war was by no means something that could be predicted, or as we have been talking, even contained, Hegseth got cold feet. And certainly the people that were there working for him were equally unenthusiastic about the idea of launching a war against Iran for all the reasons that we've just been over. Well, that made it absolutely necessary to remove his team and ultimately, I think, to remove him. And I suspect that will happen here shortly.
Well, we're certainly hearing that in the back panels right now. The Hegseth's days are numbered, even though he got a very, very bright assessment yesterday from the White House press secretary. But of course, that's usually when people do go, isn't it? The day after. Get that.
Okay. Oh, this is the best man I've ever met. I love him. He's doing a great job. And then, he submitted a letter of requesting that he resign, and we're sorry to see him go. And I don't know who they'll get, but they'll find someone, I think, in the Tom Cotton mold. Senator Cotton has been a beneficiary to the tune of millions of dollars from the Israel lobby, along with a lot of others like Ted Cruz and other senators. And I think Tom Cotton has always aspired to be the Secretary of Defense. He sees that as inevitably as his path to the White House. So he may well resign because he's got a Republican governor. And that Republican governor can appoint another Republican to be senator from Arkansas. So
yes,
he can march in there, he can take over, and then it's, as we say, Katie bar the door. It's all guns up and ready and loaded for Israel.
I want to shift to Ukraine now, which one of my favorite subject matter because
it
does involve
the death of talking about Israel.
Yeah, I'm sure we all are at this point.
It's interesting to me, and just to finish this off, I've spent plenty of time with the Israelis, and I like the Israeli military, and I'm disappointed in what's happened. I don't blame them entirely because, much like our military, they have been pushed into something that not really given a choice. but the whole thing has been a horror show. And just to finish the observation I said early on, that this would probably put the very existence of Israel at risk. And I think that's why people are now talking about the potential for real civil war on the ground in Israel. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, I just want to make sure that was understood, because I am not anxious to see Israel be destroyed. On the contrary, that's one of my objections to all of this, was that it could lead to precisely that outcome.
Yeah, well, that's precisely why I raised in Netanyahu. He's certainly doing this, I think, out of personal reasons for political survival rather than national interest. And that's what really disgusts me about this whole matter, is that he is going as far as he is for his own personal interest. But as for Ukraine, what's your reading of this right now? Because Donald Trump is supposed to be working on a peace agreement. He's got various people working on us who are at cross purposes. Some of them are neocons. Some of them want regional peace and world peace. Some of them don't want a third world war. Donald Trump made the ridiculous claim that he could solve this in 24 hours when he became president. I don't know who took that seriously, but he repeated that claim several times. But is he serious about getting a peace settlement secure here? Or is this going to take 24 years, not 24 hours?
Well, President Trump had the opportunity when he took over to do several things. He could have taken a different approach economically. He could have recognized that this is no time for the United States to engage in overseas conflict. On the contrary, we should be involved in retrenchment, shedding overseas commitments, bringing forces back. The forces themselves are not in good shape. They're not at full strength. We have a serious morale and discipline problem inside the military for a whole range of reasons we don't need to go into now. He could have said that. He could have also said that he didn't start the war in Ukraine, was not his idea. He doesn't like it, and he wants to end it. And he is directing the immediate cessation of all further support, military aid and otherwise, to Ukraine. And he's ordering the withdrawal of all U.S. personnel, military, intelligence, civilian, doesn't make any difference, from Ukraine within 48 hours. And then he could have also said, everyone knows that I love Israel, but this is a dangerous course for Israel to take. And I've got to intervene and put a stop to it, and tell Mr. Netanyahu that if he continues on this path, we will be unable to support him. Now, none of those things happened. Instead, we got an extension, for all intents and purposes, of the Biden policies, except that I would argue that President Trump has doubled down on the Israeli campaign for, regional hegemony or Jewish supremacy in the Middle East in ways that were never even contemplated by the Biden crowd. But that's where it is. So when we look at Ukraine, he had that opportunity. That was an easy one. He could have then said, I'll host a conference and let the Europeans sit across from the Russians and do everything I can to promote peace and reconciliation and so forth, essentially taken us out of the equation, which I think would have been a very good thing. Instead, we're still in the equation, but at the same time, President Trump says, well, I've had it with the Europeans. They're very, very disappointing. They refuse to do what I say, so the hell with them. And of course, that was the message that came from J.D. Vance in Munich. And simultaneously, he said something similar in the context of the Ukraine business. Frankly, I don't know why Zelensky is still there. As president of the United States, he's in a position to remove the man. He's chosen to do nothing. Now, some of that is because the same people who are supporting Netanyahu are supporting Zelensky. Let there be no mistake about it. You have the same loose configuration or congregation of people that want war in both locations. But still, he could have done those things. Now, what's happened is very simple. He's expressed the view that America's microwave mentality is frustrated. For Americans, whenever we go anywhere and do anything, we expect everything to happen immediately. There is no sense of time, no sense of distance, no sense of local, cultural, human concepts, interests, concerns. We simply walk in and we say, we are God's gift to the planet. We have all the answers, and we expect you to adopt them. Well, we don't have all the answers. And one would think after the last 50 plus years or 60 years of nonsense all over the world, we would know that. President Trump certainly expressed that view when he was president during his first term, but for some reason he's fallen back into it. And so now he says, well, Ukraine is no longer my problem. If you refuse to cooperate with me and do what I say, well, I have no time for you. He's forgotten that whatever happens, his top strategic priority is the normalization of relations with Moscow. That's important. What's happened in eastern Ukraine is irrelevant to us, but we do need to normalize our relations with Moscow. And you're not going to get a normalization of relations with Moscow as long as you continue to pretend that there is some justifiable cause against Russia in places like Crimea or eastern Ukraine. It's not. It's completely unjustified. And the Ukrainians have been badly used by the West. It was always a setup from the beginning to try and somehow or another maximize the use of Ukrainian manpower with lots of ammunition, weapons, and so forth against the Russians to wear down the Russians. Well, that's been an immense failure. Trump should have distanced himself from that business from the very beginning, because we have no interest in the destruction of Russia. We have no interest in the destruction of China. The only interest we have is stability and prosperity, particularly beyond our borders and in the Eastern Hemisphere. But he's walked away from it. So now I don't expect anything to happen that will involve us. I think this war will end when the Russians have decided they've finished. It will end on the terms that they stipulate. And ultimately, the Europeans, who without us can do absolutely nothing, will be compelled to live with it. I think NATO will fall apart. EU is well on its way. And you'll see new organizations in Europe emerge over the next few years. And I think the Germans in particular will dispose of this utterly feckless and useless governing elite in Berlin. And they'll be in the forefront of walking out of both the EU and NATO. And they'll have good relations with Moscow and Beijing. And they won't be the only ones. I think the Italians will go in that direction, as will many of the East Europeans. We just don't understand the amount of damage that our combination of inaction and stupidity have produced. But it's serious. And pretty soon it'll be embarrassing to the point where we'll just leave. We'll go away, get out.
Ukraine has lost a tremendous amount of young men and women. It's like they have destroyed an entire generation. And it's the only parallel I can see is to the First World War. And of course, this conflict, as far as I'm concerned, has a lot in common with the First World War. And with your grasp of military history, I think you might agree. But what strikes me as incredible is that if you look at the losses, 1 million plus Ukrainians dead, not casualties, but fatalities. You have to go back to the First World War. That's more than the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, the Empire, suffered. That's more than Serbia suffered, which really had. You have to look at countries like Germany and France, where the numbers were higher. But these are horrendous figures for a country the size of Ukraine, population-wise. How much longer can it possibly hold out when it's wiping out a generation like this?
This is the question that's being raised in Moscow in the inner circle of President Putin. And the Russians themselves have said, look, let's end this. Let's get on with it. Stop it. I think you're going to see a major offensive in the near future. There certainly has been a requirement to wait until the muddy season was over so that you could move large numbers of troops. He's also mobilizing another 140 or 135,000 men. You're going to have a huge mass of manpower and military power and military equipment and capability very shortly. And it's going to move west. I think the general staff in Moscow has always argued, whatever we do, we should march to the river line, because the Dnieper River, certainly for most of the history of the last sort of 800 years, has tended to be the eastern border of Western civilization. Byzantine culture and Russian civilization began at the Dnieper River. So I think there's pressure to do that. Then there is also the determination to go back to Odessa as well as Kharkov, both of which are historically Russian and Russian speaking. Odessa was never part of this Ukrainian construct. The Ukrainian construct was much further north, west, with a little bit on the east side. And I think then the decision will be made. Once we've secured this, do we now go straight into Kiev, which is something he's never wanted to do because none of the Russians want to destroy anything in Kiev. They see that as the birthplace or the cradle of their civilization and religion. But they may find that they have to do that to put an end to this. Between now and then, I think NATO will fall apart and EU will fall apart, and you may see interesting deals struck over what remains of Ukraine. The Poles certainly have their eyes on what used to be called the rest of Galicia and Ruthenia, that was part of the Austrian Empire, and now the Hungarians are interested in getting their slice back that belonged to them. I don't know what the Romanians will do and where they fit in, or what these people in Moldova have up their sleeve. But I suspect we could see all sorts of things happen in the future. But what will not happen is that we are not going to preside over some peace deal. We are not going to have the opportunity to sit at the peace table and support anything that the Russians and the Europeans come forward with. And I think the British and the French know that. But they thought that they could, by effectively holding us hostage, drag us into another conflict with Russia. That's not going to happen. That's an impossibility at this stage. So the British and the French have talked a great game, but in the final analysis, they're not going to go into Western Ukraine, because if they do, the Russians will see that as a direct provocation to their security. The Russians will move west and crush whatever is coming to Western Ukraine.
Take you back to 1996, since we're talking about NATO and the relevancy of NATO today. Christmas 1996, I'm having my Christmas dinner in Tuzla, Bosnia, which of course, where the U.S. forces were there. I was seconded as an Canadian Air Force officer to Tuzla, working under Colonel Neugebauer, who was their public affairs guy on the scene. And an incredible event happened to me Christmas Day. I was sitting at the mess table with 3 American Green Berets at my side. Across the table from us were 3 Russian special forces who had come to Tuzla just for Christmas dinner. And the interaction was that easy in those days. This was before suddenly Russia became demonized again. And I thought, isn't this emblematic of this new world we have here, where we're at peace with Russia, we're friends, and of course the two sides were trying to talk to each other. The Russians were speaking in broken English, and the Americans were doing their best to answer. And these were people who just years earlier were pledged to kill each other, but yet they were getting along, and they were doing everything they could to understand their differences. Yeah. Of course, that's not how things worked out, was it? And of course, I was there with S4, the NATO stabilization force from 96, 97. And if I recall, I believe you were a senior planner with NATO at that time, working on why NATO was bombing Serbia and on Kosovo, trying to explain that. And I was interpreting that policy to the world media in Tuzla as a public affairs officer for S4, and CPIC, as we call it, the Coalition Public Information Office. And in retrospect, do you think this is when NATO had an opportunity to say, why are we doing this? Why are we looking for wars to continue to justify our existence? The Cold War is over. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union voluntarily dismantled the Warsaw Pact. And as you know so well, NATO said not 1 inch eastward. We're not going to expand this organization. We promise you, Mr. Gorbachev, it's not going to happen. Of course, that's the first thing we started talking about. Should NATO have been disbanded in 1991? And is the only way out of this today to bring back some kind of understanding with Russia? It's not Joe Stalin's Soviet Union anymore. It's a country trying to adapt to the world today. Is the only way to get out of this to disband NATO, or will that just happen naturally?
Well, it's going to happen. NATO is going to simply vanish. Remember the old expression by Henry James: "Sacred cows are never slain; they simply vanish." Well, that's going to happen with NATO. There was an opportunity in the early to mid 90s to essentially liquidate NATO by Europeanizing it. Now, that was something that I and many others privately discussed and thought was a very good idea. The idea being that we get a European to take over the military command structure to replace the U.S. four-star. Well, when that was first discussed, everyone said immediately, well, we can't do that because all the command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, particularly everything space-based that's really critical, is all American. And so it can't possibly do that. NATO has no non-U.S. military command structure. Then there was some discussions about an EU army and an EU headquarters. And predictably, nobody in Europe wanted to invest any money in the idea. And so everybody was comfortable sitting on their rear ends doing nothing over in Europe and watching us run the show. What they did not think at the time was that we would take such a sharp turn in the direction of conflict and hostility. If you go back to 1997, 98, the hostility to Russia inside the Clinton administration, not at the top with Bill Clinton by any means, but certainly with Madeleine Albright and Vance and Al Gore, who was kind of a non-entity, but he threw his lot in with that bunch. The people in the CIA at the top of the U.S. military, and I mean the top, I'm talking about Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, things like this. It was a strong feeling, attitude that Russia had to be watched, Russia had to be contained, that in time there would be an attempt to recover in Russia. And when that happened, we had to be on our guard and so forth. That was already there. And in fact, I had a member of the Clinton administration tell me point blank in 1998, don't you understand? We are starting a democratic revolution that's going to sweep to Belgrade and from Belgrade all the way to Moscow. Well, I looked for the package of hallucinogenics on the man's desk, couldn't find any, so I quietly reached the conclusion he was no longer mentally stable. This phony notion of democracy, and I'll be perfectly blunt with you, I'm sick of the use of that term. We in the United States have never been a democracy. We were always a republic. If you were to gather the men that wrote the Constitution together and suggest that we were a democracy, they would immediately have you arrested and thrown out of the convention. They were afraid of democracy because they saw it as mob rule, which of course is exactly what we've experienced under the Biden administration, mob rule from the left. Now we're in a different environment. We have authoritarians, but now it's not necessarily the right. It's the Israel lobby, for all intents and purposes, allied with all the people that stand to benefit and make money from whatever happens. And you mentioned the military-industrial congressional complex. That's certainly a big part of it. But the lead at this point is definitely the Israel lobby. And back in the late 1990s, there were people that you saw later on, like Tony Blinken and others, who were on the periphery of what was going on in the Clinton administration. They were already in that mode of thinking and had that attitude. So I think it was a short-term opportunity, but not a very great one, because the Europeans would do nothing, and the United States tends to mortgage a lot of what it does to national vanity. And a lot of people in Washington like the idea of the United States being the quote unquote single superpower who ruled over everything. And that has brought us to where we are now. We're no longer the single superpower. We're not even, strictly speaking, a superpower, unless you just want to attach that to nuclear weapons. And we don't like it. And so now it's a backlash from the same people that got started in the late 90s in the Balkans and against Russia, and then proceeded all through the early part of this century with the goal of building up this American hegemony that was directed against any potential, I would say, competitor. And that, of course, is largely Russia and China.
Yeah. Yeah. if we look at the Canadian election, I'm sure you haven't been watching it too carefully, but what bothers me is that all of the potential prime ministers, and there's really two of them, but they're all political leaders involved in this race, are all can agree on one thing, that we have to continue to support Ukraine with money, billions into the black hole of Kiev forever, or as long as it takes. And they're using the same phrase that these lunatics, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, have been using. And and remember, the Canadian military, as you pointed out in our pre-conversation, is in worse shape than either the UK and France, and they're not laudable. They can't even fight a war. But Canada's using this phrase now about going it alone, because if the US doesn't want to fight Russia, if the US doesn't want to support Ukraine, well, we'll do it alone. How delusional and insane is that kind of talk?
Oh, completely. But my view, if I were sitting in Washington and had any authority, is I would say, good luck. Let us know how this turns out. But then again, I'm somebody that thinks we should stop embarrassing ourselves and being stupid in Ukraine. We should now do what we should have done months ago, which is end the support to the Ukrainian regime and get everybody who's an American citizen out. And I would pull all these forces that are sitting in Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania out. Get them out. It's ridiculous. There's nothing for them to do. The Russians aren't coming. So bring them home and start looking for a new European security architecture. And we should help with that, but we should not necessarily try to lead it. And we should reduce our presence in Europe to the bare minimum militarily until the Europeans decide what they want to do. But I think, as President Trump has already suggested, and others have, it's time for us to remove that U.S. four-star. The man right now, his name is Cavoli. He seems to have played a leading role in the complete failure of the Ukrainian military operation against the Russians. He seems like he should probably go anyway, along with a lot of other people. But the point is, the whole thing is over. Everybody is sort of delusional at this point, thinking that somehow or another they're going to step in and force these evil Russians back. And there's nothing to force them back from that's of any importance to us at all. And the Ukrainians, good Lord, how much more do they need to suffer? It's incomprehensible to me that our friend Zelensky and his fellow frauds have not been removed from power. But then again, I think the British and the French, but particularly the British and us, have provided him with extraordinarily good security to keep him alive. And I suppose that will continue. But I think we should end it. We should stop it and leave quietly and in an orderly fashion. We should say we're leaving and make it abundantly clear that we're not kidding. Then I think perhaps you could see some sort of peace arrangement emerge. Again, the Europeans, you've got to look at the polling data. If you go to Poland or Germany, and I consider those two states to be enormously important, both the populations have said, we want nothing to do with a war against Russia. That's very clear. So you still have this sort of delusional regime under Merz. He's another Soros exposed character. So is Macron. So is Starmer. I mean, Soros has got his fingerprints all over this sort of thing. They all have to go away. You know, these are the same people that brought in millions of so-called migrants. And these are just Muslims that were trying to bring off jihad through migration. And now they're stuck in France and Germany and other countries, and the populations want them out. And at some point, somebody's going to wake up and say, a lot of these people have to leave for their own security. You know, this is what people don't understand. We've got 51 million illegals inside the United States. Oh, no, there's not that many. Oh, yes, there are. And once the era of abundance ends, which we've enjoyed for so many years economically in this country, our artificial prosperity goes away because we no longer have a manufacturing base unless you want to count bombs and military equipment. The only things we export that anybody buys, energy and agricultural products. And now we can't export them to China anymore. And the Chinese are the ones buying it. I think somebody said there's been a 64% drop in our exports, an $8 trillion destruction of capital and wealth in the United States. Come on, this is over. It's time to get out. It's time to change. It's time to adapt. And the Russians are not fools. The Chinese are not fools. They're not interested in ruling the world, contrary to popular belief. That's not their goal. Their goal is to be prosperous and make money.
I have a question to you, sir. The Canadian election, which is this coming Monday, Mark Carney could be elected. He was installed, I believe, by the globalists to be Prime Minister of Canada. But Mark Carney could very well be elected next Monday. Mark Carney is a man who wants to replace the U.S. dollar. He said so as the governor of the Bank of England. He wants to replace the U.S. dollar with the Chinese yuan. He wants to replace the United States as the world's economic engine with China. He is in China's pocket. He is a hardcore globalist. Yet Donald Trump has endorsed him now twice. Do you have any idea why Donald Trump would want Mark Carney elected in Canada?
If you ask the Chinese, they want nothing to do with the reserve currency. They would much rather have the dollar remain the reserve currency. People don't seem to understand that. They see no benefit to it for themselves. So I think that kind of a statement is a dumb one. Now, could that happen? If we continue on the economically catastrophic path that we're on right now under Trump, I guess it could. And we'll end up probably with a basket of currencies as opposed to just one. But the Chinese have made it clear repeatedly they don't want anything to do with the reserve currency. And they're not the ones pressing for an end to the use of the dollar. What they've done is they've responded to us. We're the threatening force. And so they said, fine, if you're going to make economic warfare on us, you're going to charge all these tariffs. Well, we'll start selling off your treasuries. By the way, the Japanese have begun doing that. The Saudis have begun doing it. At some point, when it becomes a fire sale, we're in a lot of trouble because right now, foreign capital, contrary to everyone's expectation, I'm talking about Mr. Lutnick and Mr. Navarro, who've been advising President Trump on these tariffs, is not flowing into the United States. And the interests in the bond market, particularly on the 10-year Treasury, is rising. How far is it going to get? Well, if it hits 5%, that's it. We can't service the debt. We can't finance the government. We implode financially. So I don't know what this man Carney is talking about, and I don't understand the sort of hostility. Except as you point out, he seems to be connected to the Bank of London or the London banking cartel, and he's connected to the regime there that is fundamentally globalist, not just anti-American, anti-European, anti-Christian. And I'm sure he has support in Canada from people that think that being anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-European, anti-Western is a good thing. I mean, after all, you look at your own situation from the standpoint of immigration. I was in Vancouver, and it was made very clear to me that Vancouver is an extension of China in terms of immigration, with substantial Indian participation. And, where's Canada? What is Canada? What is a Canadian? We're in the same sort of position right now. People are starting to ask, what is an American? And of course, the globalists want to answer anything. Well, if an American is anything, then an American is probably nothing.
That's a very good point.
I think the problem is similar for you in Canada. But, again, it may take people time to wake up. And, my experience is that, sadly, things have to get worse before they get better.
And I think you could be incredibly right there, Colonel. And I promise to keep this to 40 minutes. I thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you back. I really wanted you on the show for so long. I admire your work, and God bless that work, and Godspeed to you, Colonel. We love you here in Canada. At least a lot of us do. So thank you for coming on the show.
I'm a big advocate for Canada. When I was in Vancouver, I told this story to the audience, and they were kind of shocked. I said, I've got to tell you, The last time I was in your country is in 1967. Everybody was shocked. I've been to Canada since 1967. No, I haven't. And the reason I was there is that my grandfather wanted me to come up so that I would see the massed pipes and drums of the Royal Canadian Army march into the stadium.
Oh, yes.
This coincided, of course, with the change in your flag. And of course, as I said earlier, I do have distant relatives that are up in Canada. I mean, I haven't met them, but we know they're all part of the same DNA project I am in Scotland, so we're all related. But the bottom line is, he said to me, "I want you to see this Canadian Army, which was really a British Canadian Army before it is destroyed by the French." Of course, he was rather anti-French at that point. And he was appalled. This is a man that was in World War I and World War II and everything. He had a different view of the world, and he was appalled at the destruction of the Union Jack, its removal from the flag. And he said, Canada is doomed. Well, let's see. In 1967, I was 14. I listened to all of this. I didn't really understand it all. I was just very happy to see the pipes and drums march in. But he had a point. What made Canada Canada was its British connection, cultural connection, identification with British culture, British identity. That's largely gone. So now you have to ask, what is a Canadian? How do we define that? And it's important because if you can't, the country won't last. Same problem for us. If we don't eventually get around to defining this is what an American is, we're not going to be around long.
Yeah, I have to agree. And that's exactly what's been happening here in Canada. Thank you again, Colonel, and I hope we can have you back on this show. God bless. That was Colonel Douglas Macgregor, one of my favorite military commentators, foreign policy commentators. You won't get better than that. This guy is always fantastic to listen to. Thank you for listening to this show today. Thank you for making this a part of your day. I'll be back again tomorrow with Jasmine Lane, who I understand has interviewed Pierre Poilievre. Yes, I'm knocking at their door too. Thanks for watching today, and God bless Canada. Godspeed to all of you. And thank you again for watching this show. And I'll be back again tomorrow, live from our nation's capital in Ottawa.